Brent crude has surged to its highest level since 2023, jumping above $90 a barrel.
With the fuel prices goes up, we will have to park the truck on the fence and just sit at home because we can't afford it to run trucks on the road.
Things, oil prices are way down. We hit $69 today. It was higher than that prior to the denuclearization of Iran.
They told you this was a global oil crisis, and they were right. The Strait of Hormuz closed on the 4th of March 2026. 20% of the world's oil supply gone overnight. The International Energy Agency called it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. Not the largest in recent history, the largest ever. 112 days later, as of this week, the Strait is only just beginning to reopen. The U.S. and Iran signed a memorandum of understanding on June 17th. The first commercial tankers started moving again, but the central deepwater channel is still mined. Roughly 80 mines still in the water. Major shipping operations say they will not fully resume until the Strait is proven safe in practice. The damage to global inventories is already done and cannot be undone overnight.
The U.S. and Iran would work together on the oil. Now, this is not just about, capturing oil in abstract. I think this is part of the bigger strategic chessmate.
Here is what the mainstream coverage never asked. In 112 days of the worst oil crisis in history, which countries actually ran out of road? And which country posted record oil production, record net exports, and record revenues the entire time?
And they can still get their oil out, and they can sell their oil to China as well.
Because the answer changes everything about how you understand this war. If you have not subscribed to Your World Exposed, do it now. Hit the bell. Every video we publish takes the story the mainstream covers halfway and shows you the half they left out. Let us go back to the beginning. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes on Iran. Within days, Iran retaliated. Missile barrages on U.S. bases in the Gulf, Hezbollah rockets into Israel, and then on March 4th, Iran announced the Strait of Hormuz was closed. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow passage between Iran and Oman.
Well, we are open to countries who want to talk to us about the safe passage of their vessels.
Under normal conditions, approximately 20 million barrels of oil, refined products, and liquefied natural gas pass through it every single day. That is roughly 20% of all oil that moves by sea on Earth. One checkpoint, 1/5 of global supply. When Iran closed it, tanker traffic collapsed. Within weeks, traffic dropped to below 10% of normal capacity. The International Maritime Organization reported 20,000 mariners stranded on 2,000 ships, anchored in the Persian Gulf, unable to move, unable to deliver. The IEA confirmed what the numbers already showed. Total supply losses from Gulf producers exceeded 12.8 million barrels per day by April. Cumulative losses exceeded 1 billion barrels. OECD country inventories dropped at a record pace, losing 146 million barrels in April alone. The EIA now projects those inventories will fall to just 50 days of demand cover by the end of 2026, the lowest level since the records began in 2003. And even with the Strait beginning to reopen, the EIA does not expect traffic to return to pre-conflict levels until early 2027. The oil price responded accordingly. Brent crude hit $137 a barrel at its April peak. The World Bank confirmed it as the highest monthly price rise ever recorded. Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan both issued warnings about $150 oil if the closure extended into summer. By every measurable metric, this was the worst oil supply shock in modern history. Worse than 1973. Worse than the Iranian Revolution. Worse than the Gulf War. So here's the question the mainstream never asked. If this is the worst oil crisis in history, why did the United States post record net oil exports in April at 5.8 million barrels per day? Why did the EIA revise American oil production upward, not downward, to 13.72 million barrels per day for 2026, heading to a projected record 14.15 million barrels in 2027? Why was America the country selling oil to the world while the world ran out? Here's the part they buried.
Right now we have a blockade. They're doing no business. I didn't like seeing boats come out.
The United States is the world's largest oil producer. That was, is. Right now, American shale fields, primarily in the Permian Basin in Texas and New Mexico, were already at or near record levels before this crisis began. When prices spiked, the Permian responded. Fracking equipment utilization jumped 20% in just a few weeks. New wells came online faster. Output went up, not down. The United States also holds the largest strategic petroleum reserve on Earth, roughly 370 million barrels in underground salt caverns along the Gulf Coast, a buffer specifically designed for exactly this kind of scenario. And critically, the United States does not depend on the Strait of Hormuz. American oil moves through domestic pipelines, Gulf of Mexico terminals, and Atlantic coast ports. The Strait is somebody else's choke point, not America's. Atlantic Basin crude exports, led by the United States, Brazil, Canada, Kazakhstan, and Venezuela, increased by 3.5 million barrels per day since February. That oil headed east to the markets that were running dry. American oil flowing into the void left by the Strait's closure at a premium price. Now ask yourself, who was actually exposed? China gets approximately 1/3 of all its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. 1/3 gone overnight. China had approximately 1 billion barrels in strategic reserves when the crisis began. That sounds like a buffer until you realize that a full consumption with no new supply coming in, that clock runs out in 60 to 90 days. China's already modest 2026 growth outlook, already under pressure from trade tensions with the United States, took a direct hit. Higher energy costs fed directly into production costs for steel, chemicals, and electronics. Chinese manufacturing margins compressed at exactly the moment China needed to compete. Japan gets approximately 70% of its Middle Eastern oil through the Strait. Japan has almost no domestic oil production. Japanese refiners immediately asked their government to release stockpiles. The government obliged.
しながら我が国の石油備蓄を活用する方針でございます。
But stockpiles only last so long. South Korea sources over 70% of its crude from the Middle East and routes more than 95% of that through the Strait of Hormuz. South Korea launched an emergency 100 trillion won market stabilization program that is roughly $68 billion, deployed in an emergency just to manage the immediate shock of losing access to 95% of its crude supply route. Europe gets 12 to 14% of its liquefied natural gas from Qatar through the Strait. Not a small number, and Europe was already energy vulnerable after years of dependence on Russian gas. The UK was identified as the most exposed major economy on the continent. Jet fuel prices in Europe nearly tripled after Middle Eastern exports were cut off. India, the fourth largest oil refining country in the world, started buying petroleum from Russia because Middle Eastern supply had evaporated. The Indian government cut excise duties on fuel to keep prices from exploding. Panic buying led to long queries at petrol stations across the country. 60% of India's household cooking fuel normally moves through the Strait. It was the first thing to run short. The Philippines, Vietnam, Pakistan, Malaysia, each facing versions of the same crisis, each scrambling for alternative supply, each paying whatever price was necessary to keep their economies moving. This was not an American crisis. This was an Asian and European crisis. America lit the match, but America was not standing in the burning building. Now, let us go one layer deeper, because this is where the story gets even more important for your daily life. Oil is not the only thing that moves through the Strait of Hormuz. The Persian Gulf is the world's largest hub for fertilizer production. The region accounts for roughly 30 to 35% of the global urea exports. Urea is the most widely used synthetic nitrogen fertilizer on Earth. It's how the world feeds itself. When the strait closed, fertilizer logistics collapsed alongside oil. Prices for urea jumped 30% in weeks. And because synthetic nitrogen fertilizer is made using natural gas, the Gulf gas shipment were also disrupted. The impact hit fertilizer production globally, not just in the Gulf. The timing was brutal. Northern Hemisphere spring planting seasons was underway. Farmers from Canada to India to sub-Saharan Africa were making purchasing decisions against a backdrop of price spikes and empty supply chains. The Food Policy Institute warned of long-term increases in food prices, not just gasoline prices, food prices at your grocery store. The Gulf also supplies a significant share of the world's helium, critical for semiconductors and medical imaging. Indonesia provides roughly half of the global nickel supply for electric vehicle batteries, and that processing requires sulfur that normally moves through the Gulf trade routes. When economists talk about supply chain vulnerability, this is exactly what they mean. One choke point, one closure, cascading failures across oil, gas, fertilizer, food, semiconductors, and medical equipment simultaneously. The IMF described it as a structural shock to the world economy, not a price spike, a structural shock. Now, to be fair, the United States is not completely immune to any of this. Oil is a globally traded commodity. When the global price spikes, American consumers pay more at the pump too, even when American producers are profiting. Gasoline prices in the United States are projected to average $3.90 a gallon for 2026, according to the EIA. That is real money out of real people's pockets, regardless of which country produced the oil. American allies in Asia and Europe absorbed severe economic damage: South Korea, Japan, India, and the Philippines. These are countries with deep economic relationships with the United States. Their pain matters to American economic interests and to American credibility in the region. And there are legitimate questions about the strategic calculus of the war itself. A Brookings Institution analysis was clear that there are no short-term policy solutions available to fully protect American consumers from globally elevated oil prices. The Permian Basin producing at record levels does not instantly translate to cheaper gas at your local station. These are real costs. They matter. The honest version of this story includes them. But here's the bottom line. The mainstream narrative called this a global oil crisis that America caused. What the confirmed data from the EIA, the IEA, the World Bank, and the OECD actually showed is a global oil crisis that exposed every major U.S. rival and every energy-dependent competitor more severely than it exposed America. China's growth prospects took a direct hit at the worst possible moment. Japan and South Korea burned through strategic reserves that will take years to fully replenish. Europe relived the energy panic of 2022, with jet fuel prices nearly tripling. India and Southeast Asia scrambled for alternative supply at premium prices, and through all of it, American oil companies posted record revenues. American net exports hit 5.8 million barrels per day in April, a record. The Permian Basin picked up the pace. The EIA revised American production upward for 2026 and again for 2027. Now the strait is beginning to reopen. The MOU was signed June 17th. The first tankers are moving, but the Central Channel is still mined. Major operators are still waiting. Full recovery of global trade flows is not expected until early 2027. The damage to OECD inventories is already done. The economic wounds in Asia and Europe are already real. The country that controls its own energy supply is not at the mercy of the country that controls the choke point. America learned that lesson during the 1973 oil embargo. It built its shale industry, its strategic petroleum reserve, and its LNG export infrastructure specifically so it would never be in that position again. The crisis the whole world is paying for is, by design or by accident, also the clearest proof yet that American energy independence is real, that it works, and that it matters more than at any point in the last 50 years. The story is never what they tell you it is. Don't forget to hit subscribe because we are just getting started.